The sun had barely dipped below the Austin skyline when a buzz of anticipation filled the state capitol. Reporters jostled for position, cameras adjusted their angles, and the hum of conversation floated through the marble halls. Students in crisp uniforms whispered among themselves, clutching notebooks, while citizens shuffled into the wooden benches, eager to see what would unfold. The air smelled faintly of coffee and anticipation, a mix that seemed to make every heart beat louder, as though the building itself was holding its breath. Everyone knew why they were there. Greg Abbott, the governor, was about to defend a bill that had sparked debates across Texas. A bill that was both praised and criticized in equal measure. But few expected the debate to take the turn it did, to become more than just words on paper. As Abbott walked toward the podium, his polished shoes clicked against the stone floor. Cameras flashed, microphones leaned forward, and the room seemed to shrink around him. He carried himself with the confidence of someone used to speaking under pressure, someone accustomed to defending decisions that affected millions. Abbott began with a formal greeting, thanking the audience for attending, acknowledging the media, and briefly outlining the purpose of the session. His voice was steady, measured, and rehearsed. He spoke of safety, responsibility, and community values, emphasizing how the bill would create clearer rules, protect vulnerable populations, and give law enforcement better tools to prevent chaos. He peppered his speech with statistics, projections, and comparisons to past legislation, carefully crafting a narrative that framed the bill as both necessary and well-considered. The words flowed smoothly, and for a moment, it seemed as though the room might nod in unanimous agreement. But then came Jasmine Crockett. She moved with a calm determination, her steps deliberate yet unassuming. She didn't rush, didn't flaunt, and didn't yell over the crowd. Instead, she exuded quiet confidence, the kind that makes people lean in without realizing it. When she reached the podium, she didn't begin by contradicting Abbott outright. Instead, she paused, letting the murmurs settle, scanning the room briefly before opening her mouth. Her tone was steady, polite, but carried an undercurrent of purpose that demanded attention. She framed her approach not as an attack, but as an inquiry, a thoughtful challenge to consider the human side of legislation. "I understand the intention behind this bill," she began, "and I know you've worked to address public safety. But I want us to think about the people who will live under this law. The everyday citizens whose lives will change because of the words on this page." The simplicity of her phrasing cut through the layers of legal jargon Abbott had just presented. No one had to understand statistics to feel the weight of her words. The audience shifted in their seats, leaning forward. Sensing that this wasn't a typical political sparring match, Abbott attempted to respond, reiterating that the bill had been carefully crafted, tested, and reviewed. He outlined scenarios where the law would prevent harm, reduce confusion, and create order. Yet Crockett didn't interrupt him aggressively. Instead, she asked questions that slowly revealed gaps in the reasoning. But what about cases where ordinary families, people who haven't broken any laws, might still be affected? How do we ensure fairness in situations that aren't neatly covered by statistics? Her questions were pointed but respectful. Each one landed like a pebble in water, rippling through the audience's attention. Students scribbled notes frantically, reporters adjusted their microphones, and even the seasoned legislators in the room found themselves reconsidering their assumptions. There was an energy in the room that was hard to describe, a mixture of tension and curiosity. The debate had shifted from abstract policy to tangible impact. It wasn't just about rules and procedures anymore. It was about people's lives, the choices they would face, and the unintended consequences that could ripple through communities. Abbott's confident delivery was still present, but now it felt somewhat mechanical compared to Crockett's human-focused approach. He cited data, percentages, and precedents, but she countered with scenarios, stories, and questions that forced the audience to see beyond numbers. As the exchange continued, Crockett highlighted a family struggling to navigate daily life in a way Abbott's speech had never addressed. A single mother juggling 2 jobs, uncertain about how the new bill would impact her access to essential services. A teenager trying to understand what the law meant for their future. These were not hypothetical numbers. These were faces, experiences, realities that the audience could relate to instantly. Her questions weren't accusations. They were invitations to think, to empathize, to connect legislation to human experience. The room's energy shifted again this time. It was quieter, more reflective. Abbott tried to maintain his rhythm, defending the bill with rehearsed arguments and procedural logic. Yet every time he leaned on numbers or theoretical examples, Crockett grounded the conversation in the everyday, reminding everyone that policy without perspective could feel hollow. The governor's speech, which had seemed so complete just moments ago, now appeared incomplete, missing the human element that Crockett brought effortlessly. She didn't need to yell, she didn't need to insult, and she didn't need to make anyone uncomfortable. She simply reframed the debate. And in doing so, she made the audience reconsider what they had come to accept as fact. By the end of her opening remarks, the atmosphere in the chamber was charged but contemplative. People were whispering, exchanging glances, nodding thoughtfully. It wasn't clear who won the first round. Didn't feel like a contest in the usual sense, but the impact of Crockett's questions was undeniable. She had shifted the focus from defending a bill to exploring its consequences. For many, this was a revelation. Debates didn't have to be about shouting the loudest or delivering the slickest lines. They could be about clarity, empathy, and insight. Outside the chamber, news crews began recording live reactions. Students lingered, discussing what they had seen, debating among themselves, and analyzing the arguments. Citizens stood with arms crossed, listening to snippets, some nodding in agreement, others frowning in thought. Social media feeds lit up almost immediately, clips spreading faster than anyone could track. Each one showing the moment Crockett calmly asked a question that made the audience and Abbott pause. The debate was now bigger than the chamber. It was entering living rooms, classrooms, and coffee shops across the city. In that moment, it wasn't about politics or party lines. It wasn't about winning headlines or social media followers. It was about a conversation that made people think differently, made them consider perspectives they hadn't before, and reminded everyone that laws and policies, no matter how well-intentioned, were ultimately about the people they affected. The evening had started as a routine defense of a bill. By the time part 1 of the debate ended, it had become a lesson in clarity, empathy, and the power of asking the right question at the right time. The sun had fully disappeared, leaving only the soft glow of streetlights and the occasional flash of cameras. Inside the Capitol, the hum of discussion continued. Abbott adjusted his notes, glancing at Crockett, realizing that this wouldn't be a simple exchange. Crockett, meanwhile, remained composed, her focus on the larger picture, on making the audience think, on connecting the abstract to the real. And somewhere in the middle of the chamber, a student scribbled the words, "Policy is about people first." It was the kind of evening that left a mark. Not because of victory or defeat, but because it reminded everyone watching that dialogue, when done with intelligence and empathy, could change the way people see the world. The chamber was still humming from the opening exchanges. People were leaning forward, whispering, trying to make sense of the debate as it shifted from numbers and policies to questions of fairness and real-life impact. Greg Abbott adjusted his notes, straightened his tie, and prepared to reinforce his argument. He had been confident earlier, but Crockett's calm, probing questions had already changed the room's energy. The audience wasn't just listening, they were thinking, and that made every word carry weight. Abbott began again, speaking clearly, emphasizing that the bill was designed to protect public safety. He described the logic behind the law, the studies that had informed it, and the framework that would make implementation smooth. He painted a picture of order and predictability, the kind of environment where rules were clear and communities felt secure. The governor cited statistics, showing potential reductions in crime and confusion. He explained that previous attempts at similar legislation had failed because they were vague. But this bill had been carefully structured to leave no gray areas. He emphasized that public safety required consistency, that rules had to be applied equally, and that citizens could rely on authorities to act within those guidelines. Some in the audience nodded, appreciating the rational, structured approach. Abbott's logic was strong in theory, but the chamber's energy suggested that the audience wanted something more than statistics. They wanted to understand the human consequences. Crockett stepped forward, not with an interruption, but with a pause that drew attention. She didn't dismiss the logic Abbott laid out. Instead, she asked the questions that had the power to connect the abstract to the personal. "Governor," she said, "we all want safer communities. But what happens when rules designed for protection end up harming ordinary families? How do we account for the people whose lives don't fit neatly into charts and percentages?" Her words weren't sharp or hostile, but precise, and they landed like a stone in water. The room quieted. Journalists scribbled notes, students exchanged glances, and even some legislators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Abbott paused, considering how to respond. He tried to explain that exceptions could be made and that the law had safeguards. Yet every explanation seemed to create new questions. Crockett pressed on, giving vivid examples of everyday people who might feel the unintended consequences of the law. A small business owner unsure if compliance meant extra cost or risk. A student uncertain if the rules would affect their ability to attend classes safely. A single mother balancing multiple responsibilities. These weren't hypothetical ideas. They were snapshots of life under the law. The kind of human stories that statistics alone could never capture. The contrast between Abbott's theory-heavy approach and Crockett's people-focused perspective grew sharper. Abbott spoke in percentages and projections, but Crockett spoke in lived experience. She asked the audience to imagine real families navigating the rules, to think about teenagers, workers, and neighbors who might face challenges the law didn't anticipate. The simplicity of her examples made the abstract real, and the audience felt it. Some leaned forward, imagining themselves or their friends in the scenarios she described. Others nodded, silently acknowledging that legislation could sometimes overlook everyday realities. Crockett didn't attack. She didn't insult. She simply asked, "Can we ensure fairness without creating new problems? Can safety coexist with empathy?" The questions were small but precise, and they made the audience pause in ways Abbott's statistics hadn't. Reporters adjusted their microphones, realizing that the sound bites of the day would not be about percentages, but about these human-centered inquiries. The chamber became a stage not for confrontation, but for thought, reflection, and consideration. Abbott, experienced and polished, spoke faster now, defending the bill. But the words felt less convincing against Crockett's calm reasoning. She continued with carefully chosen examples, moving from general scenarios to very specific ones. A young couple worried about penalties for minor mistakes. An elderly neighbor unsure how the law would affect her daily routines. And children trying to understand rules that seemed confusing or contradictory. By putting faces to the issues, Crockett highlighted the gaps in Abbott's logic without derailing the debate. The governor could cite precedents. He could explain procedures. But these personal stories required empathy, something statistics alone couldn't provide. The audience began to grasp the tension between rules and reality, between theory and consequence. Abbott tried to steer back to his familiar territory: charts, numbers, and procedural safeguards. He explained that each case would be reviewed individually, that the bill allowed flexibility, and that authorities would act in accordance with best practices. Yet Crockett's questions were relentless in their simplicity. She asked, even with safeguards, how do we guarantee that people won't be penalized unfairly? How do we prevent small mistakes from creating lifelong consequences? Each question peeled back another layer, making the audience consider complexity that had been buried beneath legal jargon. The energy in the room shifted again. Supporters of the bill could see its intentions, but Crockett's perspective made them question its execution. Those who were initially skeptical felt validated, realizing that their unease wasn't misplaced. Students whispered to each other, comparing the abstract legal logic to the real-world examples they knew personally. Reporters began discussing how the conversation would sound on air, realizing that Crockett's approach created stories people could relate to. The chamber was no longer a place for simply defending a bill. It had become a space for dialogue about fairness, responsibility, and empathy. Crockett didn't rush, didn't raise her voice, and didn't play politics. Instead, she framed her questions to invite reflection. She reminded the audience that laws might be written for broad protection, but people lived in narrow, complex circumstances that couldn't always be anticipated. She asked them to imagine neighborhoods, workplaces, and homes, to think about the people who might feel unseen or unheard under new legislation. Abbott's prepared arguments had not failed, but they now had to compete with a perspective grounded in human experience. And it changed how everyone in the room perceived the debate by the time Part 2 of the debate came to a close. The atmosphere had transformed. It wasn't a confrontation, but a conversation that challenged assumptions and invited reflection. Abbott remained composed, but the audience had seen that numbers alone weren't enough to justify the bill. Crockett had reframed the discussion, reminding everyone that safety and fairness had to coexist. The journalists outside the chamber already sensed that their headlines would focus on the tension between the law and everyday life, on the questions she asked rather than the statistics he presented. Outside, students lingered in clusters, replaying the examples in their minds. Citizens discussed what they had seen, noting how the debate had made them think about their own families and communities. The debate clips were already making their way into social media, emphasizing Crockett's.com intelligent questions. People were sharing and debating, not because of who was right, but because the discussion had made them reflect on the human side of policy. It was clear that this would not be a simple story of politics or procedure, was a story about balance, understanding, and seeing beyond the numbers. The sun had disappeared completely, leaving only the soft glow of lights from the Capitol. The chamber was quieter now, though the energy lingered. Abbott adjusted his notes, realizing the conversation had moved beyond formulas and percentages. Crockett, meanwhile, maintained her calm composure, aware that she had successfully shifted the focus from theoretical justification to human impact. In that moment, it wasn't about winning or losing, it was about making people think, about showing that even the most carefully crafted rules had real consequences in everyday life. And as the audience began to file out, there was a sense of clarity, of understanding, and of questions yet to be answered, marking Part 2 as a pivotal moment in a debate that was only just beginning. The chamber had settled into a charged silence. Abbott's earlier confidence had faded into careful consideration, while Crockett's calm determination filled the space with a subtle tension. She had reframed the debate, making abstract statistics tangible and human. And now the real test had begun. Could Abbott respond without appearing distant from the lives affected by his bill? Crockett didn't rush. She let her questions hang in the air, allowing the audience to feel their weight. People shifted in their seats, leaning forward, drawn into the unfolding conversation as if they were participants rather than mere observers. Abbott began to speak again, citing procedural safeguards and pointing to examples where the law had successfully prevented confusion. He emphasized that the bill included checks to ensure fairness and that authorities would be trained to act appropriately. On paper, his points were strong. On the floor, however, they felt abstract, like armor that protected theory but not the individuals inside the system. Abbott's voice carried confidence. Yet it was increasingly clear that the audience craved something more than logic. They wanted context, clarity, and empathy. Crockett seized the moment. She shared a specific story, not hypothetical or generalized, but a vivid snapshot of real-world complexity. She described a young family living in a tight-knit community, a family that relied on multiple support systems and simple routines to navigate everyday life. Under Abbott's bill, even small missteps late paperwork. Minor misunderstandings could trigger penalties, she explained. "These are the people your statistics don't capture," she said, her voice steady, never rising. The chamber shifted again. The abstract danger Abbott had described now had faces, names, and struggles. Reporters leaned forward, sensing the drama in her calm delivery. The story was no longer about legislation. It was about life. Abbott responded, citing exceptions built into the law. He detailed the ways authorities could adjust their approach, highlighting discretion and procedural review. But Crockett was ready. She asked, even with safeguards, "How do we prevent a system designed to protect from unintentionally punishing those who are just trying to live their lives? How do we ensure that fairness is not just a concept, but a reality?" The simplicity of her phrasing made the question hard to dismiss. It wasn't a partisan attack. It was a practical inquiry about the human side of governance. The audience murmured, some nodding in agreement, others pausing, reflecting on their own experiences. The debate began to feel like a dance. Abbott spoke with authority, aiming to ground his points in structure and logic. Crockett moved fluidly, reframing, questioning, humanizing. She didn't need volume. She didn't need aggression. Her calm, methodical approach forced the audience to reconsider, and even Abbott had to acknowledge the weight of her reasoning. She shifted from broad examples to smaller, more personal ones. A high school student facing new restrictions. A local business owner unsure if compliance meant penalties. An elderly neighbor navigating a complicated process to maintain basic services. Each story illuminated a different angle, consequence Abbott hadn't accounted for in his prepared speech. The room grew quieter, more contemplative. Students scribbled notes furiously, inspired by Crockett's ability to translate abstract law into tangible life experiences. Journalists adjusted their microphones, realizing that the moments worth capturing weren't Abbott's statistics, but Crockett's questions and the human stories she brought to the forefront. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible at first, but unmistakable. Abbott's defense of the bill, logical as it was, had to compete with human narrative and for many in the audience. The narrative won, Crockett pressed on, highlighting unintended consequences that might not have occurred to lawmakers. She asked the audience to consider the ripple effects of legislation. A minor misinterpretation could cascade into larger problems, affecting families, neighborhoods, and local businesses. She reminded them that behind every statistic was a person, a story, a life. Policies don't exist in a vacuum, she said. They impact real people every day. And if we're not careful, the very measures meant to protect can become sources of stress or harm. The simplicity and truth of her statement resonated deeply. It wasn't dramatic or flashy, it was real, grounded. An immediate Abbott responded with patience, attempting to bridge the gap between procedure and consequence. He spoke about training, about review systems, about appeals. Yet the more he emphasized safeguards, the more Crockett highlighted scenarios where safeguards might fail, or where everyday life wouldn't neatly fit into procedural checkboxes. The contrast became stark. Abbott's world was structured, precise, and orderly. Crockett's was lived, messy, and human. And in that contrast, The audience began to see the real challenge of policymaking, balancing order with empathy, rules with reality. The tension grew, but not in a combative way. It was a thoughtful, intellectual tension that invited reflection rather than shouting. Every question Crockett asked seemed to pull the audience deeper into the human consequences of the law. She didn't need applause. She didn't need validation. Her focus was on clarity and impact, and that alone gave her words power. Students whispered to each other, imagining themselves or their neighbors in her examples. Reporters captured the exchange, knowing this segment would resonate far beyond the walls of the Capitol. The debate had shifted from abstract defense to tangible consideration. Crockett's storytelling technique was subtle but effective. She moved from micro to macro, showing how small decisions could ripple outward, affecting whole communities. A mistake by one person under the law could inadvertently create stress, confusion, or financial strain for an entire household. By giving real-life shape to abstract consequences, she reframed the discussion. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about understanding the full spectrum of impact. Abbott, no stranger to scrutiny, found himself navigating territory that prepared speeches and charts could not fully address. The audience began to respond in quiet, thoughtful ways. Some nodded, reflecting on the stories. Others exchanged whispers, considering how legislation affected their neighborhoods or families. The debate was no longer confined to political lines. It was a shared exploration of fairness, responsibility, and empathy. Abbott's words still carried authority, but Crockett's questions created connection. She humanized the discussion, made statistics breathe, and forced everyone to confront complexity in a way that was both respectful and compelling. By the end of Part 3, the room had transformed. Abbott adjusted his papers, acknowledging the challenge of balancing logic with real-life impact. Crockett remained composed, calm, and deliberate, knowing she had shifted the focus from abstract rules to human experience. The audience left with questions, not answers, questions about fairness, empathy, and the unintended consequences of legislation. Students discussed the debate outside the chamber. Journalists filmed live reactions, and citizens began sharing clips. Drawn to the clarity and humanity Crockett had brought to the stage, as the lights dimmed and the chamber emptied, the energy lingered. Abbott's arguments were solid, but Crockett's questions had opened new lines of thought. People didn't leave thinking about statistics, they left thinking about life, families, and everyday struggles under laws designed to protect. The moment had become more than a debate. It was a lesson in perspective, empathy, and the human side of governance. And for everyone watching, either in the room or through screens across the city, it was clear that this conversation was far from over. It wasn't a matter of right or wrong. It was about understanding complexity, thinking critically, and seeing people before policy. The chamber had quieted, but the tension lingered in the air like an electric current. Abbott adjusted his notes and straightened his tie, his face calm but thoughtful, aware that the debate had shifted in ways he hadn't anticipated. Crockett stood with measured composure, her eyes scanning the audience, knowing that she had drawn attention to the human side of legislation in a way that numbers and statistics could never capture. Both leaders understood the weight of what had just transpired. This wasn't about who won or lost, but about opening a door to deeper understanding. The people in the room felt it too: students, reporters, citizens leaning forward, engaged, thinking, questioning. Abbott tried to summarize his defense one more time. He emphasized the importance of law, structure, and clear guidelines. He spoke about security and protection, about frameworks designed to ensure fairness and consistency. He cited precedents and examples, reiterating that every law carries intent and safeguards. Yet, even as he spoke, the audience's attention shifted subtly. Many had already been drawn into Crockett's perspective. the human-centered view that asked them to imagine consequences beyond charts and percentages. The governor's words were technically sound, but they now competed with stories that had resonance and emotional weight. Crockett didn't rush. She allowed Abbott to speak fully, listening with calm attentiveness. When it was her turn, she returned to the core of her argument not as a counterattack, but as a reflective dialogue. She reminded the audience that the best policies weren't those that merely followed procedure, but those that anticipated human experience, that understood context, and that considered the complexities of daily life. She used concrete examples, painting a picture of ordinary citizens navigating regulations with courage, patience, and sometimes confusion. Each story was brief but vivid: a student trying to meet expectations, a single parent managing work and school, a small business adjusting to rules that seemed designed for efficiency rather than empathy. Crockett's approach had a rhythm. She asked questions that made the audience think, not react. How do we make sure fairness isn't just a word? She asked. How do we ensure that protection doesn't become punishment? That guidance doesn't become obstacles? These questions were simple, but they cut through the complexity of the legal language that Abbott had spent minutes unpacking. People in the audience murmured in agreement, nodding thoughtfully. Students jotted down notes, inspired by the clarity of her perspective. Even the reporters realized that these lines would resonate far more with viewers than any data Abbott had cited. Abbott tried to respond, walking the line between defense and concession. He acknowledged the importance of fairness and human experience, while reiterating that laws needed structure to work effectively. Yet Crockett's framing had already shifted the narrative. The audience could see that both order and empathy were necessary, and that finding balance wasn't straightforward. It was a nuanced discussion, not a simple debate. Abbott's points remained logical, but they now existed alongside Crockett's vivid examples of real people. And the contrast made the discussion richer, deeper, more human. The room seemed to lean in with every word. Crockett highlighted the ripple effects of decisions, the indirect ways a law could impact lives, and how well-intentioned rules could sometimes create unintended stress. She reminded the audience that while safety and structure are essential, human consequences are immediate and tangible. Her delivery was calm, deliberate, and measured, forcing people to consider the world from someone else's perspective. The power of empathy, she demonstrated, could transform debate from argument to insight. Abbott responded with measured detail, pointing to oversight mechanisms and procedural safeguards. But Crockett anticipated each point. She framed questions that were precise yet open-ended, inviting reflection rather than confrontation. Even with safeguards, she said, how do we ensure everyday families aren't caught off guard? How do we make sure children, workers, and neighbors aren't facing consequences they didn't anticipate? Her words made people pause. They thought of their own families, neighbors, and workplaces, connecting legislation to daily life in a way they hadn't before. The chamber felt alive with shared understanding. A quiet energy that wasn't about partisanship, but about human concern. As the debate reached its conclusion, both sides had done their part. Abbott had defended the law with authority, reasoning, and structure. Crockett had humanized the discussion, illustrating the stakes for ordinary people and inviting empathy alongside logic. The audience recognized that this wasn't a matter of winning or losing. It was a lesson in perspective, in considering consequences, and in understanding the interplay between policy and real life. People in the room whispered to each other, discussing the examples Crockett had provided and the principles Abbott had defended. The debate had sparked curiosity, reflection, and conversation that would continue long after the chamber emptied. Students lingered at the back, talking in hushed tones about the real-world examples, imagining themselves in similar situations, and realizing how laws affected lives in ways they hadn't considered. Reporters captured reactions, noting the calm yet powerful framing Crockett had brought to the discussion. Citizens nodded thoughtfully, reflecting on what fairness meant in practice, not just theory. Social media feeds lit up with clips and quotes, showing Crockett's questions and stories, sharing the debate with audiences far beyond the room. Her focus on the human element had created engagement that statistics alone never could. Crockett's calm composure had set the tone for the evening. She didn't need applause or drama. Her words and examples carried their own weight. She reminded the audience that while rules are important, the lives affected by those rules matter just as much. Every person in the room seemed to carry a piece of that reflection as they prepared to leave. Abbott, experienced and composed, recognized the importance of her approach. Numbers and statistics were valuable, but human perspective could not be ignored. The two-perspective structure and empathy had coexisted on the stage, creating a dialogue that was both intellectually stimulating and emotionally resonant. As the chamber began to empty, people paused at the doors, discussing what they had seen. Some spoke of the rules and logic Abbott had defended, others about the human impact Crockett had illustrated. There was no consensus, no decisive victory, but a shared understanding that both perspectives mattered. Students compared notes, neighbors exchanged observations, and journalists debated which angles would resonate most with viewers. The discussion had expanded beyond political lines into something broader, an exploration of fairness, responsibility, and the balance between order and human experience. Outside, the city lights of Austin glimmered, and the evening air carried a sense of reflection. People walked home in small groups, talking about the debate in terms they could understand, connecting it to their own lives and communities. Crockett's calm questions had left an impression that statistics never could. Abbott's structured defense had reminded everyone of the necessity of rules. Together, they had framed a conversation that was nuanced, thoughtful, and deeply relevant to anyone living under laws that affected everyday life by the time the last attendees had left. The chamber was quiet, but the energy lingered in memory and conversation. The debate had achieved something rare. It had invited people to think critically, to empathize, and to consider multiple perspectives without turning to hostility. It had shown that intelligent discussion could be respectful, engaging, and impactful. Abbott's argument had been strong in theory, Crockett's questions strong in practice, and together, they had created a moment of reflection that would stay with the audience long after the evening ended. In the end, the debate wasn't about winning or losing, it was about understanding, about seeing beyond one's own perspective, and about connecting policy to people. The stories of ordinary families, the questions about fairness and consequence, and the discussion about structure versus human experience had created a narrative that was thoughtful, balanced, and emotionally resonant. Everyone in the room left with a reminder that the most important debates aren't always the loudest, but the ones that make people think, reflect, and see the world through someone else's eyes. And so, as the lights dimmed and the city outside moved on with its evening, the chamber held the echoes of a conversation that had been more than politics. It had been a lesson in clarity, empathy, and the power of thoughtful dialogue. The debate between Abbott and Crockett had ended for the night, but its lessons lingered, inviting every listener, viewer, and participant to think about fairness, responsibility, and the human side of every decision. It was a reminder that policy isn't just about rules, it's about people, and understanding that is the first step toward meaningful change.